Welcome to Politics Chat today. I realize I forget to introduce myself. I'm Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history, and I will tell you today I am exhausted because I'm doing media for this new book, and it's just a lot. It's a lot to stare at that little green dot for a long period of time. So I'll do the best I can today, with the caveat, the warning that I have not read the news. Except real skims in between podcasts and stuff that I've been doing. So let me get right down to it and tell you, therefore, that I won't necessarily be as up to speed as I would be if I hadn't done so much as I've already done today. So let me start with some of the questions that you people asked. And people asked me about the book tour and said that they're very unhappy that a lot of the venues filled up instantly. And I have two things to say about that. The first is that I think that the people who were planning the book tour and planning the venues weren't really aware of how many people might be interested in this book for many reasons. And so there have been a lot of switches to larger venues and so on. But just so you know, there are two things you need to know. The first that you need to know is that what I have posted is the first month of the book tour, which is handled by Viking, the people who published the new book. And I'm going to continue to tour for the next year, but those tours are not yet public. I hate to give you cities because I actually don't handle that. Somebody else does. But I know, for example, I'm going to be in Cleveland. I know I'm going to be in Minneapolis. And of course, now I can't think of any of the other cities, but I'm going to be in a lot of places that have not yet been made public. So it is certainly possible that you're still going to be able to get to hear me live. That being said, of course, you hear me live here all the time when I'm actually much more relaxed than I will be in those settings. But just so you know, I make it sound royal, right? But what I mean by that is my assistant and I and my wonderful agent. We were talking about this, and the obvious answer, first of all, is that I'm going to do some events here, live for people here. And I have not announced that before for this reason. I want to take your questions. So rather than doing what I'm going to do elsewhere, which is have conversations with other writers, which I think will be more fun than me just sort of talking, which is, sometimes what people do. And I'm certainly not going to read anything. I'd like to answer your questions, not necessarily about the book, although I'm happy to answer questions about the book. But I thought it might be more fun if we do things that way. Do not put them here, because one of the reasons I haven't announced this yet is because I want them to be separate so I can look them over. Let me just tell you what those dates are, because they already are on my calendar. I will post these as well, but I am planning to, we picked two times, one for thinking that we would make it easier for people who are centered around my time zone, and another to make it easier for people in other countries and in other time zones. So we are currently planning to hold those on Tuesday the 19th at 8 p.m. and on Wednesday the 20th at 12 p.m. So I will tell you more about those, but those will be more I wouldn't say informal, but you get to direct those a lot more than you would if you were listening to me talk to some of these other wonderful people I'll be talking with across the country. That being said, a number of the venues are also, have live streaming. And I don't remember which ones those are. If you want me to, I'll post that again. But you can live stream some of these. I'm very excited about some of the people I'll be talking to. My only problem will be letting them ask me the questions rather than the other way around, because if you could talk to Jane Mayer, wouldn't you ask her everything? All right, so that was the first question. And I'm sorry, somebody asked September or October. September are the live ones. I will do this. I wanted to do them before I started the book tour because I thought you guys should have the first crack at me. So whatever dates I just gave you were in September. That was a week from today and a week from tomorrow. So September 19th at 8 p.m. I think I will write this down. No, that's it. September 19th at 8 p.m. and September 20th at noon at 12 p.m. But I'll do a call and I'll ask for questions. So think of things you'd like, maybe fun things you'd like to listen to that there's going to be all kinds of media of me talking about the book and about sort of the themes and all that kind of stuff, which I'm more than happy to do. But this is your chance um, uh, to ask the kind of things that I'll answer to you, and that somebody like Jane may or may not ask me. So I will get there. All right. That, I think, is all the business that. Oh no, you asked about Now and Then. The Now and Then podcast, the last one will drop tomorrow. I will give you a spoiler. We all cried at the end of it. It's a phenomenal team. We really loved working together. It was a business decision to take it off the air. It was not our decision. And you've asked if we are to, first of all, yes, the episodes will all be archived, so you should be able to get them. And we have been talking to people about taking it elsewhere. I don't know what that's going to look like yet. And I don't know. I don't know. I cannot tell you how much I love working with Joanne. Love to have input for what you think we should do next. We are not disappearing. We just don't know what the future is going to look like yet, and how it's going to play out. I know we had so much fun, but I'm always wary about moving backward. I'm not entirely sure we should try and replicate what we had with that team, because it was so special. But there'll be something else. We just got to figure out what it is. Okay, so I think that's all the business, and that's a good thing, because I'm looking at the wrong note. Okay, so I have things in no particular order. I did have a chance to skim through your questions. And I think that maybe we should start with the big story today, which I can hear all your heads all over the world going, impeachment. And that's actually not, I think, the big story today, although it's certainly a story today. What's happening right now with the government is huge. And let me just back up a little bit there. You know, if you read me, that I've been focusing a lot on foreign affairs, because what I try and do is I try and look at what this era will look like from 150 years in the future. And I am not, or was not anyway, when I started writing the letters, a specialist in foreign affairs. But what Biden has done with the United States' foreign affairs is a game changer. And, you know, I was writing about some of the many things he'd done the other day, and someone said, you know, not everybody thinks AUKUS is such a great idea, which is a new security pact centering around the UK and Australia and the United States. And my answer to that was, I'm aware that not everybody thinks it's a good decision. And I'm not entirely sure that I am qualified to say whether or not it is. Whether all the changes he's making are good or not. That's not something I'm trained in. What I can tell you is that these are game changers. I don't know how they're going to play out, but they're definitely game changers. And I think what Biden and Blinken, the Secretary of State, and his administration are trying to do is to square a circle, if you will. There has always been a problem in the United States with the idea of spreading democracy. And this has been a problem literally since the 19th century, when the United States first began to engage in imperialism in places like the Philippines and in Cuba. And before that, even when the United States was talking about engaging in things, even if it wasn't doing it yet as effectively as it would in the 20th century. And that is that, how do you impose democracy? I mean, it's like a jumbo shrimp, right? That's kind of not the point. And that's something that Andrew Carnegie, for example, said when the United States was first trying to impose imperialism on the Philippines. He's like, how can you put the Declaration of Independence by force into a schoolroom in the Philippines? But the problem with democracy and spreading democracy is that it has always, coming from the United States, had an element of colonialism in it. And I think what the Biden administration is trying to do is find a way to shore up the idea of self-determination, not necessarily democracy, but self-determination without colonialism. And the way that you do that, I think, or at least the way they are conceiving of it, and mind you, I'm doing this only as an observer. I'm not part of any discussions or anything. I'm reading what they say. I'm looking at the speeches. I'm looking at who's moving where and who's doing what, the same way I would if this were all history and I didn't know these people. Not that I do know these people, but you know, I can't go question William Jennings Bryan on why he's doing what he's doing. He's been dead a long time. So that's how I'm accustomed to looking at things. And what I am seeing is an attempt to reinforce the idea of representative governments under whatever form they take in different areas, that are brought together as regional groupings in which the United States would like to have a seat, if it can, as it does in the Indo-Pacific. We make a big deal out of the fact we have a Pacific coast. Lots of people have said, wait a minute, why are we getting messed up in the Pacific? And the answer to that, coming from Biden and Blinken, is, hey, we got more Pacific coastline than many of the countries that are traditionally thought of as being part of the Indo-Pacific. So we're part of the Indo-Pacific. So I think what they're trying to do is to reinforce that idea of regional powers, centers of regional power that need to take responsibility for their own internal issues, but that they're also trying to raise the standard of living around the world, not only by investing heavily in infrastructure, but also by therefore tying countries to less developed countries to developed countries. And one of the pieces of that I'm watching, and I don't know if this is right to watch or not, but the fact that the recent investments in places like the rail lines that go through the Middle East, for example, and through Africa look a great deal like the kind of investment that the United States made in infrastructure in Europe after World War II under what was called the Marshall Plan. And what I'm watching there, and I could be wrong about this, but what I'm watching there is that the Marshall Plan was designed to stabilize those governments, many of which seemed as if they were about to become communist governments in Italy, for example, after World War II, to stabilize them under democracies or under representative governments, and also to provide international markets, especially international markets for the United States, which is one of the things that drove the extraordinary economic growth of the United States after World War II. So I don't know. I mean, but that's one of the things that the reason that I'm focusing on that so quite a bit more, I think, than most of the mainstream media is because it certainly looks to me to be a game changer. Now what it is changing the game to, I am less able to say, because as I keep harping on, I'm a prophet of the past, not the future. But I do think that's very important to be looking at. And one of the things that the person who helps me understand the world always says is pull out a map. So when we start talking about some of these regions, pull out a map, because once you see the map of Africa and you see where Ghana is, for example, and you see where, the Sahel region is, it all makes sense. And so when I write those letters, it would be good to pull out a map when you look at those things. And yes, somebody just said our railway system could certainly use expansion, and I am 1,000% on board with that. That's a great deal more difficult to get through Congress, except for the fact, of course, we have the bipartisan infrastructure law, which does in fact invest in our rail lines, in our transportation lines, and we have the Inflation Reduction Act, which invested dramatically in climate change measures to address climate change, including between that and the Chips and Science Act, the development of alternative energies and alternative cars. So anyway, there's a lot going on, but I just wanted to sort of put down a marker there that I think what's happening in foreign affairs is, even if you think you don't care about foreign affairs, it just feels important. It feels really important to me. All right. So that being said, one of the things that I'm looking at right now is today, I said that the most important thing today is not impeachment. The most important thing that I think is happening today is that Congress is back from its August, that's the word, August recess. And it certainly looks as if the extremists in the House Republican Conference, who are known as the Freedom Caucus, are going to shut down the government. So let me start by explaining the difference between the debt ceiling, which you've asked about, and a government shutdown. Sometimes I feel like we could use easier words than we do when we do government stuff. Maybe it's that they have so much of a history of things that have already taken certain names that it gets more and more difficult. But anyway, the debt ceiling, which was on the table earlier in the year, was the fact that by this weird statute that America has, and I've explained this before. I'll explain why we have it. There is a limit to how much money the Treasury can borrow. So even if Congress has appropriated more money than that and said, oh, we're going to give 40 billion here, and I'm making this up, but 40 billion here, 100 here, whatever. If they have said that the Treasury has to spend that money, the Treasury can't do it until Congress raises the amount that they're allowed to borrow. And that doesn't make any sense. So let me explain why we have it. And the reason for that is until World War I, when Congress wanted to raise money, it literally would sit in Congress and it would argue about whether we were going to issue Treasury bonds that matured in 7 years, or should it be 5 years? And should they be 3% or should they be 3.5%? And Congress would argue through these different measures of raising money. And it took a lot of time, but that didn't really necessarily matter in the 19th century because the government, aside from the Civil War, the government really wasn't spending that much money. In fact, it had a surplus for a number of years, which is itself a cool story. But so what that meant was that Congress itself took on the issue of deciding it needed money and raising money. And so the Congress or the president would go to Congress and say, hey, I need X amount of money, and Congress would say, oh, okay, so we're going to raise that amount of money. What happens is during World War I, the government needs money so fast that essentially Congress had no opportunity to do anything other than sit there and argue about the different ways that it was going to raise money. So instead of saying, okay, we're going to keep doing this arguing, what they did is they said to the Treasury, we don't care anymore. You do it however you want, but we're just going to tell you how much you can borrow. So rather than saying to you, do 100 million of these bonds and 30 million of these bonds and 15 million of these bonds, we're just going to say to you, you can raise $200 million and we don't care how you can do it. But if you need more money than that, come back to us and we'll raise it again. But we want to keep an eye on what you're doing. So it's a holdover from that old system. And it really wasn't a problem until very recently in the United States when people on the right started to say, well, wait a minute, we don't like that the Congress is passing these measures that cost a lot of money. So instead, we're simply going to refuse to raise that amount. So even though we have taken on that debt, we're going to refuse to pay it. And what that would do is it would throw the United States into default. That would essentially be declaring bankruptcy. It wouldn't be exactly declaring bankruptcy, but that would do it. And what it would do, first of all, no one quite knows entirely because it's never happened before, but it just would be fiscal suicide in the sense that it would make sure nobody ever trusted us again. It would certainly downgrade our credit rating, which happened after the debt ceiling crisis earlier this year. Fitch has reduced the rating of U.S. credit. That's going to cost us a lot of money in additional fees because we can't get the good deals we used to be able to get. But it also would remove the United States from a seat at the head of the table forever, because who would ever trust us again? We are the monetary system that underpins the globe. So it was just bonkers that the Republicans were thinking about doing that. And it's a problem going forward. There are a lot of people who, and I was one of them, who said this is the 14th Amendment, we should just be able to do this. And I would be happy to argue that one, but that's not what you asked about today, because the debt ceiling, in fact, they came up with a deal. If you remember, there was that long, drawn-out period where Representative Kevin McCarthy, who's a Republican from California and Speaker of the House, kept saying, oh, Biden won't talk to me. Well, that is literally because Biden produced his budget as he was supposed to, a little bit late. It was about a week late. And the way that's supposed to work is then the House comes back with its budget, and this House was never able to come up with a budget. So Biden said, I'm not going to talk to you about the debt ceiling or anything else until you actually do the work you're supposed to do, and they were never able to do it. So finally, Biden and McCarthy, at this point, the Republican senators washed their hands of the whole thing. And they came up with a deal, and it agreed to across-the-board cuts to a certain amount. And it was not as much as the Republicans wanted, but it was more than the Democrats wanted. And if they got that, they were willing to go ahead and allow the debt ceiling to be raised until after the 2024 election. So that's the deal that happened. Instantly, the far right in the House went went ballistic, and they said, we don't approve of this. We want deeper cuts. We didn't agree to this, and we don't like McCarthy, and we're mad that he did that. All right, so this has limped along all through the spring. And what we're looking at now is not the debt ceiling. That's been raised until 2025. Okay, so that's off the table. What we're looking at now is the funding of the U.S. government. The fiscal year ends on September 30th, 2023. And by the way, all of you people who do these things out there, why can't the fiscal year end at the same time every other year does? I'm sure there's a reason, but there's so many different fiscal years, and it's exhausting for people like me. All right, I'll stop. There's nothing to do with anything. So what we're looking at now is the attempt to fund the government in 2024, from the day after September 30th, which would be October 1st, through to the next September 30th, right? But the issue here is that normally, in normal circumstances, appropriations bills are they're pretty straightforward. Both parties try not to clutter them because they just want to get them through. They're important to do, and it's not mechanical. There's a lot of work that goes into them, but they're not generally political footballs. So what's happened is that before the congressional recess, the Senate went ahead and passed its appropriations bills out of committee, and it did so by bipartisan votes, which is common, but they did a really good job. The leaders of both both parties who are doing the appropriations bills are both women. And actually, all four of the people doing it are women this time around, and they just did a really good job. And they were really good about complimenting each other and saying we're in this together. And so they passed their 12 appropriations bills, and I'm not going to explain why, but there were 12 appropriations bills that came out of the Senate that came out of the Senate Appropriations Committee, and that are ready to go forward. Done, right? How I wish. The House, in contrast, the extremist Freedom Caucus in the House used those appropriations bills as a way to push through, first of all, cuts that were way bigger than McCarthy had committed to. So they reneged on his deal and said, we don't care what you think. We're going to go ahead and cut the way we want to. And what they cut was everything, basically. But what they cut was deep cuts to the IRS, which, that one always jumps out to me because we know that funding the IRS is worth across the board about for every dollar we spend to fund the IRS, we get on average about $6 back. But what the expansion of the IRS from its real lows starting in 2010, because it's been underfunded for a long time, is going to do has already begun, and that is that the IRS is auditing about 1,600 extremely wealthy people that they know have cheated to the tune of more than $250,000. So funding them is going to pay back in a really big way. And this is one of the things that the Republicans want to cut, which says to you, it's not about money, it's about the kind of society they're trying to build. They dramatically cut SNAP benefits to women and children. I just looked at all the numbers this morning before I started doing media. They cut funding for schools in impoverished districts. Did I say the EPA? They cut the EPA quite dramatically. I mean, all the things that you can imagine they did. In addition to that, though, they put into these appropriations bills something called a poison pill. And what a poison pill is in government is it's something that is simply not acceptable to the other side. So out of the 12 appropriations bills that the House Republicans can't even get out of the Appropriations Committee, are 8 of them that have anti-abortion regulations and anti-LGBTQ or anti-gender affirming care rules. Now, these have nothing to do with the appropriations, of course. This is their way of continuing their culture war through this appropriation system. Now, so what does this mean? First of all, this means that it appears unlikely that even most Republicans will go along with these, because these are not popular. I mean, things like cutting the EPA or cutting SNAP benefits for women and children is not something generally that people like. So they're trying to push this really extremist agenda that's too far even for most Republicans, let alone for the Democrats. So they might even not get out of the Appropriations Committee. If they do get out of the Appropriations Committee, they're almost certainly not going to get out of the House. If they do get out of the House, there's no way in Hades that they're going to get through the Senate. And even if they did get through the Senate, Biden has already said he's going to veto them. And that's not just about what's in them. It's about the idea that this is a really small minority of people led by the likes of Florida Representative Matt Gaetz and Georgia Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene and Colorado Representative Lauren Boebert and a number of these really far right representatives who represent a really small minority of Americans getting their way by essentially threatening to blow up the government. And this is a place where people like me would argue you don't negotiate with hostages, with hostage takers, you don't negotiate with terrorists. That's the word. I'm sorry, I'm tired. You don't negotiate with terrorists because then they're going to do it again. And this is precisely what we have seen on the one other occasion in our history when somebody tried to do this in 1879, which I'm not going to go into now because it's already 4:30. But so where does that leave us? One of the things, first of all, it leaves us with the recognition that we probably will have a government shutdown, but it could be worse than that, in that one of the things that Matt Gaetz from Florida has been talking about for a while and reiterated again today was his fury with Kevin McCarthy. Now, if you remember, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy had, I think it was 15 failed votes for Speaker, which hadn't happened since the 1840s, I think it was, maybe the 1830s. And in order to get that speakership, he cut a deal with that far-right caucus. And one of the things that he agreed to was the idea that a single person could challenge his speakership. And one of the things that Matt Gaetz is threatening to do is to challenge that speakership. And he's got a whole bunch of rules for why hi, Lisa from Maine, and Jody Mills from Maine. Oh, now I'm going to watch things here. I'll stop. One of the things he could do is to challenge McCarthy and start a whole fight over the speakership again. Now, there's only 12 legislative days before a new funding for the government goes into place. And 12 days to get 12 bills through is a very hard thing to do anyway. So what normally one would do under these circumstances is pass a continuing resolution or pass a short-term fix until they can get around to getting the appropriations done. And people like Gaetz are saying no, they're simply not going to do it. And somebody in The Guardian a few days ago referred to this group as people who just want to smash things. And that's certainly what it looks like. So it is certainly possible that people like Gaetz will use their power of that single vote to challenge McCarthy and to tie the House up in a fight over the speakership, which would mean that the appropriations wouldn't get done. And in fact, they would manage to smash things. Now, let me go a little bit further than that. So I'm going to do a little bit of a detour here. One of the reasons that other Republicans don't like what these folks are doing is that whenever that the Republicans have done a shutdown like this, it always backfires on them. People know exactly what's going on, and they're mad about it, because when you say government shutdown, that's not them simply saying, oh, you can't visit the Lincoln Memorial. It means Social Security checks. It means the military getting paid. It means getting to go to get your driver's license or your passport, or all the many ways in which the government funds the basic pieces of our existence. And those, people like to have those done. And, if you've planned, even if it's just going to a museum, if you've planned your whole vacation and going to a museum and you get there and it shuts down, it's happened to me before. And you're mad because you're like, really? Like, really? I just spent thousands of dollars to fly across the country to go to this national park and it's locked? There's a pay for that. And every time the Republicans do this, the Republicans pay for it. Apparently, the Freedom Caucus doesn't care about that. So that's one of the reasons that the rest of the Republicans may not go along with that. And it may open up a way for them finally to silence the Freedom Caucus once and for all by saying, okay, we're going to work with the Democrats from now on, which would be really interesting itself. Anyway, so why did I start with that? Because funding the government is enormously important to all of this. But One of the conditions, and there are a number of them now, by the way, it's not just this. The Freedom Caucus wants to stop sending money to Ukraine, and it wants to have its own policies in place on the border, even though constitutionally it's the president who's supposed to do border security. Somebody just said, of course, that would shut down the paychecks of the Congress people. Yes, that's true. But it is my impression that most Congress people, not all of them, not the younger ones, but most of the older people are not terribly concerned about where their congressional salary is going to come from, because it's a lot of money to you and me. They have some money to fall back on. That's my impression anyway. I've never done a study of how wealthy all the Congress people are, but I think people like Maxwell Frost and AOC are exceptions because they're younger than the Pelosi's and McConnell's of the world, right? All right. So one of the conditions that the Freedom Caucus and one of the demands that the Freedom Caucus has made is an impeachment inquiry into President Biden, which is what a lot of people thought the top story was today, but I think it's actually a subset of this. This is an important story, but it's not an important story because Biden has done anything wrong. It's an important story because he hasn't done anything wrong. And when I say he hasn't done anything wrong, let me explain what I mean by that. What the current crop of far-right Republicans, Jim Jordan of Ohio, James Comer of Kentucky, Green, Boebert, Gates, all those guys, what they are pointing to is a series of rumors from when now President Biden was Vice President Biden under President Barack Obama. And those rumors were so unsubstantiated. Remember, there's been Trump in office since then, that Trump's own Justice Department, which we know he weaponized against a number of people, refused to touch it. So it's not like this is something new they've discovered. And what you have seen from them is a ton of allegations about whistleblowers. And you've heard me say this before, me going, I don't know that they're whistleblowers. And I keep looking, I kept looking up again and again, are they really whistleblowers? And what I meant by that is that there is an actual meaning for a whistleblower in government that is different than sort of the generic idea of a whistleblower who tells on someone. And if you are a whistleblower in the United States government, you have made a complaint that is heard by the Inspector General of that particular agency, that person believes is urgent and credible. So I can't go in off the street and say that Merrick Garland has dug up my daylilies, because first of all, it wouldn't be credible. I'd have to show some evidence, and I don't think Merrick Garland's ever been to my town in Maine, and my daylilies are intact. So it would be a hard thing for me to prove. What you do is you go to an Inspector General and you say, here's this happened, and the person looks at your evidence, and they might say, well, thank you very much, have a nice day. Or they might say, this is real. And this is what happened over the phone call that Donald Trump made to Zelensky. There was a whistleblower about it, went to the Inspector General and said, doggies, we got a problem here. And the Inspector General said, oh my God, you're right. So I kept looking at these so-called whistleblowers and saying, I don't see paperwork. This is one of the reasons I love doing political history, is there's almost always paperwork, right? And I kept saying there isn't paperwork, but they keep calling them whistleblowers, so maybe I'm wrong. There's got to be paperwork. Well, we learned as of yesterday that, in fact, there is no paperwork on these people. These are just people who claim to have stories. Well, that, and I keep saying $5 will get you a cup of coffee at Starbucks, right? So this is what they keep trotting out. And their witnesses are not saying under oath what people like James Comer say they're saying when he goes in front of the TV cameras. So what's going on? First of all, they have demanded an impeachment of President Biden. And of course, both Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene have introduced impeachment papers against Biden. I think that's why Greene called Boebert, but a bitch on the floor of Congress, is because Boebert did it first. I could be wrong about that. I got a little confused and all that. and all that mess, and life felt a little too short to care. Um, but I think that, this has been going on for a while. But there's no grounds. And this is a bit of a problem if you're going to announce an impeachment. You need something called grounds, right? And you need to be able to have people testify under oath in order to do something, right? So what happened today is that McCarthy announced that he was backing an impeachment inquiry. Well, what's an impeachment inquiry? This was his way, it appears, of splitting the baby. He knows he doesn't have an impeachment case here, but this, with luck, will shut up the Freedom Caucus enough that they'll be willing to move forward. Now, instantly, Matt Gaetz got out there and said, hey, it's not enough for me. I want something more than this. But that itself is really interesting because think about it. What is going on with this idea of an impeachment inquiry of Biden when there isn't, somebody, a playbook, I think today said, well, there's nothing, there is not any credible evidence. There's no evidence. It's not even just credible evidence. There's no evidence of anything. And this is one of the things that I find fascinating in many different ways. Biden's been under the microscope forever, and he's known as being squeaky clean. That's not to say he always makes good decisions. There are plenty of things in his past that, people like me or you could have problems with, but they're not secret, And somebody said to me, this is really an aside, I'm sorry, I'm tired. Somebody said to me, Biden had a secret sex island the same way that Epstein did. And I couldn't resist. I said, really? Who flew the planes? Who were the waitresses? Who cleaned the rooms? Like, who drew up the taxis? I mean, you couldn't be somebody that public and get away with secrets like that. And anyway, that's a rabbit hole. But so anyway, if you don't have the evidence, why do you want this inquiry so much? And this, I think, is crucially important. The reason you want it so much is not because you think you're going to convict the man of anything, but because you are going to do the exact same thing that Trump was trying to do when he made that phone call to Volodymyr Zelensky in July of 2019 that came out in September of 2019. They're trying to smear him, but through an investigation. Because if you remember, Trump didn't ask Zelensky to investigate Biden or Hunter Biden. He asked Zelensky to announce an investigation. And the reason that I think this is fascinating right now is because that's essentially now what our Congress people are doing. The exact same thing for which Trump got impeached, but now it's become part of the Republican Congress. They're announcing an investigation with the idea that people will say things like, oh, there's incredible evidence, meaning that there is some evidence. There isn't. There's no evidence. But this is how you build a narrative to suggest that that Biden is just as corrupt as Trump is, and that the idea of convicting Trump for all the things he appears to have done is a weaponization of the Justice Department, despite the fact that Biden has been incredibly careful not to touch the Justice Department. So it's this kind of magical moment of, and I don't mean that in a good way, but of smearing the president by using the power of the government. And that seems to me something it's really, really important to be aware of, because it is something that certainly enabled Trump to win in 2016 when they employed it against Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. It's something he was trying to do again in 2019 against Biden. And now it's something that the Republican Party itself, with the Speaker of the House, has put a stamp of approval on. That's something we need to be really concerned about, not least because it mirrors what the corrupt Ukrainian oligarchs used to do against their enemies, announce that they're going to do these investigations and convince people that if there's smoke, there must be fire, and therefore managing to smear them. And the US press plays into this in a way that somebody articulated very well, I thought, today, when he said that one of the reasons that people are paying such attention right now to Biden's age, Biden is 80 years old, I think, Trump's 77, and Biden's in really good shape compared to Trump. He's actually in good shape compared to me as well. I mean, he's in good shape. He's also just done this whirlwind tour of the world in which he has pulled off, some really amazing things, done press conferences all night, all through the night, done all kinds of stuff. And yet they're focusing on his age. And what somebody put really interesting, and not Trump's, and what somebody put really interestingly, I thought, was that because the Republican candidate is so deeply flawed, that people who are trying to make sure they don't sound like they're in the tank for somebody are magnifying something that is suboptimal against the Democrat in the running. So here, Biden's old. It'd be great if he were 60. It'd be even better if he were 50, but he's not. He's 80, which brings with it a lot of age and experience, but it also brings with it a higher chance of death. It brings with it, all sorts of aging issues that may be offset by the fact that he's got so much wisdom and so many connections that he can pull off these extraordinary feats like the trilateral meeting with Japan and Korea, which, by the way, would be a game changer in any administration and barely got a blip on most people's radars. It's true that he's an older man. But because it is suboptimal and the press is trying to balance the fact that the Republican frontrunner is indicted close to, has got like close to 100 charges against him and has been convicted of or liable for rape and like all this kind of stuff, they're making that a much bigger deal than it should be in the scheme of things because they don't want to sound like they're in the tank for Biden. And that's a real problem because what's on the table right now is not a political race between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. It is literally a fight for the struggle, a fight for the survival of democracy, and ought to be framed as such. And so this is one of the places where they can have a pretty good sense that the press is going to play along with them on this, and that's really deeply problematic. All right, so that covered a lot of the things that you asked about. I hope in a pretty comprehensive way. But let me now get to some of the specific questions you asked before I wrap this up. And that is, oh, I'm sorry. Ken, my problem is I can't see the thing myself. Am I slumping down again? Is that better? My problem now is if I move the thing, then it can't be posted on. I'm sorry, I'm having a conversation with somebody who helps me on the video. And I guess I was sliding down in the chair. I guess that's better. So somebody just said, by the way, that Biden has dementia. I'm just gobsmacked that even somebody would try and say that, in the sense that if you listen to his speeches, remembering that he stutters, and if you listen to his press conferences and his extraordinarily comprehensive agility with foreign affairs, if nothing else, although he's very good on other subjects as well, that's just a talking point that has no meaning. It really has no meaning. So whoever is trying to say that is clearly a troll, or simply not paying attention. Mind you, I do this for a living. He's got extraordinary depth, and when you compare it, I'm not even going to go to Trump, to somebody like Tommy Tuberville, or even some of the other candidates who don't know the basics of our foreign affairs. It's just no contest. All right. So some of the specific things that you asked about is, somebody asked about why it is legal to lie, which I talk about a lot. I always say, take a look at what people say when they have sworn to tell the truth and they are in danger of perjury versus what they'll say in front of the cameras. And Rudy Giuliani, Trump's former lawyer, is a great example of this. He kept going out in front of the cameras and talking about how, there were all these, suitcases full of ballots and all kinds of stuff. In a courtroom, he said the opposite. He said that he had made defamatory statements against Ruby Moss and Shay Freeman. And he, I might have that back. I'm sorry, Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss. It's Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss. I'm sorry, I've been doing this all day, so I'm slipping on some stuff. Speaking of dementia. for just from exhaustion there. He actually said, no, I defamed them. He just tried to say he hadn't caused them any distress that he should have to pay damages for. Boy, that ain't going to fly. But once he was under oath, he told a completely different story than he said in front of the TV camera. So I always say, wait and look and see what people say when they're under oath versus what they say in front of the cameras. And somebody said, well, why is it legal to lie? Because it's misleading so many people. And the answer to that, I think, is really interesting and actually quite important, because we have the right, the freedom of the press, but we also have the right to say what we think without interference from the government. That's in the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights are in the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution. And the reason that that matters is because what the first 10 amendments to the Constitution do is they hold back the federal government. They don't give us individual rights. Weirdly, that's a little bit different. They don't say, hey, you have the right to say whatever you want. That's not what they say. The first 10 amendments say the government doesn't have the right to stop you from doing that. The government can't control what you say. It's a hedge around the government. It's not a gift to an individual. And that's a really important distinction to make, because of course it's going to involve things like the ownership of firearms. The Second Amendment was intended to keep the government back. It wasn't intended to confer certain rights. And it certainly says the same thing. You do not want the government to come after you and say, you're not allowed to say that. I mean, under any circumstances. Somebody said the other day, the government really should step in and stop people from lying, to which my answer is no freaking way, because who gets to decide that? But that being said, one of the things that the press and people like us, now I don't mean me as somebody who does the public stuff, but as an individual is supposed to do is say, hey, wait, that's not true. Prove to me what it is you are saying. And that's what we as constituents and as consumers of media are supposed to say. When James Comer says, Biden took bribes, which now he's walked back, by the way, but when he said that, show me the proof. And you will note that he was never able to do that. He kept backing away and dancing around issues. And you see this again and again and again. Somebody will say something. The other person who does this all the time on the media is Jim Jordan and Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee. She just makes stuff up, It's not true at all. And when people push back, they simply don't answer. And that's our job, is to say, you are not telling the truth. Or if you are, prove it to me. And that's actually one of the reasons I always put footnotes in the letters that I write, because those sources could be wrong. I don't know statistics, for example. So if I cite a statistician and you come back at me and say, oh my God, how could you take this person seriously? They didn't count, they're counting in different measurements. I would listen to that and I would say, you're right. And I would change my mind and I would change what I'd written. That's how you move the ball forward in a society based on the idea of the Enlightenment, that you can make a reasoned argument. That's our job, is to hold our politicians accountable and to say, you are not telling the truth. If you're going to sit there in front of the TV cameras and tell me that there were ballot boxes stuffed, show me where that is. And that's what theoretically should be happening when we have things like an impeachment hearing, where theoretically people should be should be sworn to tell the truth, but they're not. When the Republicans are having these hearings, they're not swearing in their witnesses, if you actually look at the transcripts, which are available. So that's kind of our job, and why we don't want it to be illegal to lie, because if you give the government the right to say what is a lie, you're into a whole lot of dangerous territory. Now, that being said, you're not allowed to have certain kinds of speech. You're not allowed to have speech that leads to crime. You're not allowed to have speech that leads to fraud. You're not allowed, there's all kinds of limits to speech if it leads to some sort of injury to somebody else. I'm sorry, I slid down again. All right. So that's why we don't want the people to, the government to be able to stop us from lying. But the point I wanted to make there is that I think it's so important that people understand that the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, do not confer individual rights. They hold back the government from preventing you from having those rights. And while that sounds like it's the same thing, it's really, really not. So the government can't stop you from saying certain things. That doesn't necessarily give you the right to say them. It says the government can't stop you from saying them. And while often those two things are the same thing, they're not always the same thing, and that actually matters. All right. People asked again whether or not Trump is covered by the 14th Amendment's clause that prevents somebody who is engaged in insurrection from holding an office under the United States. And this is really interesting. Major constitutional lawyers, both center left and center right, agree that yes, he is covered by that. And certainly he seems concerned about that. There are 2 states now in which plaintiffs have asked secretaries of state to remove him from the 2024 ballot because he is ineligible under the 14th Amendment. And that is along the lines of that article I've referenced before by the 2 Federalist Society lawyers who say that the bar to holding office if you've engaged in insurrection is self-fulfilling. That is, nobody has to vote on it. Nobody, simply a registrar will, a secretary of state will say, no, you can't be on the ballot because you're 16 years old. You can't be president. And that statute, that's part of the rules for being president. No, you can't be on it because you engaged in insurrection. Undoubtedly, that will go to the Supreme Court, which may or may not decide to take it. But the fact there are now 2 states that are arguing that indicate that the pressure is increasing. And, personally, I think, yes, absolutely. The 14th Amendment was designed to cover exactly this sort of an instance. And I would say farther than the president, but down to everybody who participated in that. But I'm a historian. I'm not somebody who's going to be arguing this out. The fact that a number of lawyers on the right have begun to say the same thing is itself interesting, and we'll see how that plays out. All right. So other people have asked a couple of things that are interesting. Why don't we have term limits by age? Because we only have had recently modern transportation and modern medicine that have enabled people to live much longer, much healthier lives. And the modern transportation that makes it possible to get to and from Washington very easily. Think about it. Until we really get safe air transportation, which is really perfected as late as the 1970s. That's not to say it wasn't safe before that, but it was quite safe and reliable really beginning in the 1970s. Until then, you didn't stay in Congress that long because until you were elderly, because you didn't want to be going back and forth all the time. You wanted to stay at home, and your health probably wasn't very good. So this is something we have not yet come to grips with. That being said, I'm nervous about the idea of setting a term limit by age simply because, I know people who are in their 90s who are freaking sharp as tacks, and I know people much younger who are not. And I think that that's one of those things that we should leave voters to decide personally. And that's certainly the way that the framers thought about it, that voters should be able to decide whether or not they think someone is telling the truth and whether or not they think somebody is still steady on their pins and so on. My guess is that that's one of the things that we're going to see a change in the next generation, not necessarily in having term limits, because constituents like to vote for whom they want to vote, but where there might be a different culture of how long someone stays in Congress. There are a couple of things here. Oh, there's another interesting one. Somebody asked why antitrust laws have not really been enforced in such a long time. And I'm going to be writing about this quite a bit going forward because the Biden administration's antitrust division is really starting to flex its muscles. And this whole thing with Elon Musk and Starlink and its relationship to the Ukraine war is tangled up in that. There are many different aspects of that, but it's tangled up in that. And the reason that antitrust laws have backed way the heck off since the 1980s is because of a theory that was advanced by Borg. Remember the guy who was not confirmed to become Robert Bork, who did not become confirmed for the Supreme Court, argued that antitrust laws should only go into effect when it affected the price of things. So the idea of corporations getting bigger and bigger and lowering wages, for example, could be good for the consumer because it could bring down prices. And if you make prices the common denominator for antitrust, what that means is that everything else goes by the wayside. Uh, um, Competition is first out the window because things get bigger and bigger. Um, Workers' rights go out the window, the environment goes out the window. And this is one of the things that the Biden administration began, I think it was in July of 2021. I don't remember the date off the top of my head, to push back on and say, hey, wait a minute, competition really matters, because unless you have competition, you don't have the ability to have innovation, and people can't start businesses, and workers are going to take a hit. So they started to focus not only on making things cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, but on protecting competition. And with the protection of competition also goes more rights for workers, because doing things, simple things that didn't get a lot of play but that really mattered, doing things like making people stop signing non-compete uh, uh, documents to go from one menial job to another. That was huge in getting people to be able to switch jobs for better pay. And one of the reasons that pay went up so dramatically among people at the very bottom of society in the last couple of years was because it was no longer legal to force people to sign non-compete clauses. So you couldn't go to McDonald's when they offered higher wages. And a lot of people were like, that doesn't matter. Well, you know what? It matters a lot when you're when you're going to, I used to work in the food service industry, but when you're going from job to job, to be able to do that without somebody stopping you, and to be able to move to a better position. So I think that's really interesting that has changed, and that's going on. And I'm going to write about it because I think it really matters, and it's not getting a lot of attention. And that was known as the Bork rule, by the way. Some of the other things that you didn't, I mean, you did ask about this, and I'm over here, so I will. You've asked about you've asked about Project 2025, which I've written about a lot, and I will talk about more. It is, in fact, a blueprint for destroying democracy. It's 1,000 pages long. It's out there. You can read it. I will talk about it more in the future. I did want to talk just once again, lay down a marker about Tommy Tuberville and his hold on military promotions, because coming up very quickly now is the fact that the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, is going to have to step down by law. It's not a custom or whatever, but because we don't want to have a society where the Joint Chiefs can stay on the chair of the Joint Chiefs, and the Joint Chiefs is the guy over the person, not necessarily the guy, who oversees all the heads of all the military departments. That person by law, has to go away at a certain point, and Milley is going to have to go away. And recently, Tuberville was called on that, and he said, "Well, he'll just stay on, or we'll just stretch that." And when somebody told him that he had to go by law, Tuberville didn't know that. And the fact that he is putting this hold on our military leadership and everything that implies, and he doesn't even freaking know the ins and outs of how that position works. Just, you can tell my blood is boiling over that. So I want to keep that one on your radar screen, but I want to end where I always do. Oh, and one other quick question. Somebody said, why are there no other Democratic candidates other than Biden? For two reasons. One, because anytime you challenge an incumbent, he's going to lose. And I can give you a whole list of presidents that happens with. But two, and this is really important, Biden has had one of the most successful presidencies since before my life, since at least LBJ, and probably since FDR. And the idea of abandoning somebody who was the most successful presidency since FDR is bonkers. So, do people wish he were younger? Probably. But on the other hand, he has been able to nail together what he has because of his connections and his long history. So it ain't going to happen. And this, I think, is really interesting, because what it's doing is it's letting younger Democrats, and the Democratic bench is very deep, get a lot more experience. So you've got Kamala Harris, who has actually been all over the world doing all kinds of stuff. You've got people like Gavin Newsom, clearly waiting in the wings, but doing so less as a person involved in foreign affairs than he is in really taking the fight directly to the Republicans. You have Gretchen Whitmer, who is rebuilding Michigan in really progressive ways with a very small margin of power. You've got I'm sorry, I'm not going to go through the whole list, but you got Amy Klobuchar doing similar things. There's a lot of people involved here, and I didn't mean to slight anyone here. That was just off the top of my head. And that's all to the good, because they're getting experience that they're going to need, and they're all young, and they're all going to be able to move up. Not obviously all of them into the White House, but they're going to all move up into other positions of power or other places where they can affect society. So one of the things that I wanted to emphasize here in terms of going forward, because you always ask me this, what can I do? What can I do? And I think the answer to that is really to recognize going forward that it's time to stop letting the far right Republicans define the United States and to define what we're looking at. So the idea here, for example, that Biden is corrupt, and it's getting all these headlines today, that they're opening this impeachment inquiry, that's entirely playing their game. That's saying we're going to accept them and we're just going to push back against it. We're not going to do anything new. When the reality is there are real problems in this country that the Biden administration is trying to solve. Now, you may not like what they're doing to solve them. That's fine. Bring your own ideas, because first of all, I don't know about you, I'm sick unto death of these people. I never want to read another tweet from Donald Trump again as long as I live. I could write them at this point, and they're just not interesting anymore. What is interesting is people saying, as they are doing now, the answer to the future is biofuels. And somebody else coming back and saying, I disagree with you because that's hurting biodiversity. So we're going to have to work that issue out. That's really interesting. What is the solution? I don't know, but maybe some of you do. And that creativity, that ability to redefine what this country is what the rest of us have. And at this point, I feel like there's ropes around our ankles tying us to Matt Gaetz, who is an unimpressive character no matter how you slice it. And that just feels like such an enormous waste of talent, of the future, of the time we have on this earth, and of this country that we live in. So when people say to me, oh my God, what can I do? What you can do is to start to tell your own story about the United States, about good things, about things that have been triumphs, about things you'd like to see addressed, about things you could maybe do to address them, about people you could work with to make change happen. And doesn't it just feel like, to me, the September always feels like a new start. It just feels like it's time. It's time to stop letting Donald Trump, who, by the way, worked apparently with the Freedom Caucus to get this impeachment of Biden through. It just feels so 2019, so 2016, so 1994. It's time to say, we're done. We're done with that crap, and we actually want a government that works for the majority of us. And here's what we think that government should look like. And one of the things that I've really been pushing on lately is the idea that you get rid of an old sour narrative, not by arguing with it, because then you're locked into it, but by creating a new narrative and making a new exciting narrative that people want to be part of. And face it, we're good people. We're nice people. We're fun to hang out with. And that's the kind of thing that all of us can do going forward, is create a future that people want to be part of. All right, so I'm going to let you go. It's been a long day for me, and I still have to write tonight. Thank you for being here, and I will post more information about the two book things I will do here, including places for you to ask questions about what you would like me to talk about in those. All right. Or I guess if you want me to do a different format than that, I just thought that would be fun. All right. Thank you for being here. And I'm now going to go look at the news. Talk to you soon.